All right, good morning, everyone. We're here to talk about getting started with provider-hosted apps. We're going to talk a little bit about on-premises. We're going to talk a little bit about cloud. And we're going to try to walk you through our kind of great recipe for building good provider-hosted apps. We'll talk a little bit about what it takes to get into it. We'll talk a little bit about what it takes to build one and make it better throughout. Click. All right, so for those counting at home, every great presentation this week should have had at least one picture of a cloud, at least one Surface, at least one HoloLens, at least one multi-platform, and a kitten. If any of your presentations throughout this week did not have those components, they should not be rated as high as ours.
We've at least earned a 3, like meets expectations just for that, I think.
Yeah, I think we need a battery or something. So who am I? My name is Israel Vega. I'm an independent consultant. Used to work for Microsoft for a while. There's my Tweety handle. There's my contact information. Ask me about OAuth and mannequin heads. I have a thing where we try to look at. Ask me about them later. This is Richard.
Hi, my name is Richard Azariga. I work within Microsoft, a group called Developer Experience. So we work with developers to try to maximize their use of our platform, whether that be things in Office 365. And if you ask me, I really truly see both Office 365 and Outlook and Exchange and SharePoint as platforms that we can extend to do more with. You can follow me at Rich Diz. That's also my blog, and really excited to be working and presenting with you guys today. So just to kind of paint the picture of kind of the vision around Office 365, we have kind of a two-pronged approach on how we want to deliver extensibility out to users that are using the Office suite. The first of those is the traditional way that we have extended the Office platform. When I say the Office platform, I include things like SharePoint for sure. And so that first way has been, I want to extend that user experience. So that's putting an add-in. And if you've seen, we've even renamed it. We don't call things apps anymore. In fact, anytime one of us say apps on stage, he gets shocked. He has some sort of thing on. I don't want to know about it. But ultimately, we're calling them add-ins now. We felt that was a lot more easy for people to relate to. If you tell someone, hey, I need to put an add-in, they typically understand what you mean by that, whereas we confuse a lot of people with the concept of apps. But we've had, regardless of what you call them, we've had that in Office since the beginning, right? We had the ability to go, whether it was break out and do some VBA or macros within Office, or early in the days of SharePoint of creating WSP packages and deploying those out into a SharePoint farm so that I could get web parts or maybe a site definition or something that I wanted to use. The other kind of concept that we're starting to get into is say, well, rather than just being very contextual where I'm strongly coupled with Office, maybe I want to run standalone. Maybe I just want to connect into SharePoint and use its file storage or use its search capability. Maybe I'm building my own standalone web application, or maybe it's even a mobile application that we want to be able to consume those services. And that's really where we've started to invest a great deal. And what you'll see is that we're even starting to have where provider-hosted apps can start to bleed into that concept of being a standalone application. Today, with a provider-hosted app, the only way I can get to it is with some sort of SharePoint context. I have to at least know the site that I'm coming from in order to get context and call into SharePoint. And so some of that is going to be changing. To break that down a little bit more, this just kind of breaks down kind of that full view of things, right? Is that we've had that complete Office suite that is something that we want you to be able to extend. And then connecting into it, we see it as commodity things, like going and be able to get to files or get to search or get to sites within SharePoint. And that's really kind of what we're trying to complete, is that vision around it. And then finally being able to do that with whatever platform you want, right? I know no one in here could say back in the 2010 to 2013 days, they were building web parts in SharePoint with PHP, right? That just wasn't something that we allowed you to do. You couldn't even use .NET with MVC. You had to really be shoehorned into the way we wanted you to build those. So to kind of talk about add-ins and how they might look and the different shapes of add-ins, what I thought we'd do is just start with kind of an end-to-end scenario. So what I'm going to show you here is the app that we're going to build today from the very start. And so what we try to do is pick a scenario that uses all the different ways that you can surface a user experience inside of SharePoint in a provider-hosted app. And we'll go in those in more detail, but we created a really simple app that does small links or tiny links or bit.ly type links. And so I could go simply to a document library here, and I have a deck in my library. And if I go up to files, here's kind of the first way we might extend that user interface is I might have a command that I want to run, some sort of add-in command that I want to go and perform an operation using that. So in this case, I have this little link that says get a small link, right? And so that's one way that I can surface my customization in this add-in model. And so if I click on that, we'll immediately get a second type of user interface. So in this case, I'm actually leveraging things like the SharePoint dialog. So I kind of used those together. I used this command to go off and launch this dialog that I'm now processing some information behind the scenes. And what I ultimately did is I got the URL of the item, sent it back to a service, got back a little bit.ly link, and hopefully if everything worked right, I should be able to copy that and go and paste it into a browser. And there we go. We get our file that it's being delivered to us. Just to kind of complete this out a little bit more, we also have the concept of a full page experience with this that we'll look at. So it's like if I wanted to go and look at all of my small links, I can go and click on this page, and it brings me to a full page of all the small links that I've generated within my site. Now, we'll get into kind of how we can deliver this full page experience, even though we've decoupled the experience and how it integrates in with SharePoint. But we can do that. And then the final thing we might want to do is maybe I want to create a site page just to display within my site, or maybe even on the landing page, I want to see all my little site links. So I'll just go out here and maybe edit my page. And one of the most popular customizations in all of SharePoint is a web part. And so if I wanted to, I could come in here and maybe say, let's go and insert a special web part here that we have that's called small links. So I'll go ahead and insert this guy into my page. Save my page. And now I have a web part that's we're being able to deliver using this add-in model. So we'll look at all the different components on what it took to put something like this together, how we use all those different shapes, how we connect in and use all the different APIs, and how we do that in a secure manner. And so with that, let's look at our recipe for building a good application like this.
Switch over. So what we tried to do was come up with a set of steps, a set of very simple steps. So we came up with something 10 steps or less. This is our recipe for great SharePoint add-ins, right? If we look at breaking down what is it that you're actually doing, you're always going to be doing these things. You're always going to be figuring out how to plan. What am I going to be building? You need some proper tools to actually go ahead and create that experience. So we'll show you what those proper tools look like. You're going to build it. You're going to actually go through, write some code, integrate, build some services, and so on. Then you want to blend it, and we'll talk about blending it. What that blending means is really, what do I want my user experience to actually be when I'm done? You're going to want to secure it, right? What is it that I want to do for my end users? How do I want my apps to actually communicate? Thank you. And then we're going to ship it. We're going to get it out the door. Negative ghostwriter. The pattern is full. All right. All right, so let's look at the first step, planning it. So what we did was we provided just a set of questions for you. We're not going to go through every one of these questions. When you pull down the deck, you'll be able to see it. It's more of a reference slide. We'll pick 2 or 3 of these. The first one is, do I want to distribute my add-in? That's the first one. How do I want to actually get it out to the masses if that's the case? That path is going to help you determine how I'm going to build my app, how I'm going to host my provider-hosted app, and where I'm actually going to put it when I'm done as far as deployment. The other one that I want to look at is, will my app support one tenant or many? So if I'm an ISV and I want to build for multiple Office 365 tenants, I'm going to build my app in a certain way. If I'm only looking at one specific tenant, my own, or maybe it's for a customer, if I'm a consultant, for example, then I'm going to build my app a different way. For what features and functionality do I need? I also have to look at that because that helps determine which API set I'm going to use. Am I going to use the SharePoint API set? Am I going to use the Office 365 API set? We'll talk more about the differences and how you make that decision moving on. So let's look at some quick vocabulary. When you're building provider-hosted apps, aka add-ins, there's some things that, just verbiage that you have to understand. If you're coming from the SharePoint world, which most of you were, you understand webs, you understand sites, right? Site collections, SP site, SP web. We understand that. But there's another web. There's a couple other webs and some other logical components you've got to think about. There's an app web, which is a place where my app will actually be sandboxed to write things. I can write list information to my app web. I can pull information from my app web. And that's just a web that's sandboxed for my specific app. There's the host web, and the host web is the place where my provider-hosted app is being hosted. It's the environment that the end user added my app to. And the remote web, in the case where I'm looking at an API, my remote web is the one that's over there, right? It's the other one that I'm interacting with. Shapes, Richard talked about that. Registration, we'll dig deeper into the registration components. Your different app types, we'll talk a little bit about that as I go through the proper tools section, but really the vocabulary part is SharePoint apps. What is a SharePoint app? Provider-hosted apps. What is a provider-hosted app? And auto-hosted apps. The reason we put it up there and we scratched it off is because you will still see it in the tooling. However, auto-hosted apps are deprecated and we're not supporting those anymore. So that's not something you can build on anymore. As far as tokens, we'll talk a little bit about the different types of tokens and permissions as well. This is just to get you into vocabulary, the vernacular of what it is that we're going to be building. The next step is using proper tools. And the thing about proper tools is, what is it that I'm actually going to be doing to build? A lot of times when you're doing SharePoint, you've traditionally done it using Visual Studio 2010, 2013, and so on. Well, when you're in this world of hybrid, we're going to be building apps for the cloud. We might be building apps for on-prem. What does my tool set actually look like? Well, your tool set's going to be pretty broad because you're going to need to do a lot of different things. What we have there is just a quick list of some tools, and then we also put some definite tools that you might need. For example, Fiddler, Wireshark, if you're trying to capture some communication back and forth between the different apps. And your development environment is really going to be any web device, any place you can build HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and so on. Your best experience for building these apps is definitely going to be Visual Studio because that's where the tooling is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use your favorite tools and frameworks and so on. On the server side, you're going to be able to use ASP.NET MVC or web forms that you're traditionally used to. You can also use PHP, Node.js, pretty much anything you want on the server side. On the client side, you can use all your favorite frameworks, jQuery, Angular, Knockout, whatever you want. On the UX side, right, that's been a big complaint around SharePoint. Can I make it responsive? Can I make my app responsive and so on? You're going to be able to use anything you want. Bootstrap, put jQuery UI up there, Zurb Foundation. Really, it's your choice. And that's the premise of the provider-hosted apps. You are the provider. You are bringing the infrastructure that's going to host the application. What SharePoint and Office 365 is providing you is the data, right, the data part of it. All right, so let's take a quick look at an environment here. All right, so let's switch over. So here I am on my Office 365 tenant. We can pretend that this is an on-premise environment because it's going to be the same mechanics. The user interface will be a little bit different. We're not showing you anything that's Office 365 specific. Here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my managed site collections, and where I'm going to start is to create a new site collection. Where I'm going to start is by hitting F5 to refresh my validation token. Then I'm going to hit private site collection. Now on premise, this user interface again looks a little bit different, but the site that you really want to look at is this template called developer site. Whenever you're starting to build a provider-hosted app, you need a place to host your development environment. You don't want it to be production, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to create a developer site collection using this developer site template. What this does is it activates some features on the back end, and it allows you to deploy from Visual Studio. What we'll show you later on is how to get your app from that development environment over to production as well. So I've already got a developer site. So let's look at how to connect to it. We're going to open up Visual Studio. And what I have here is Visual Studio 2013. And I have the templates for SharePoint and Office. And the template that you want to look at is this app for SharePoint. So we'll walk through this wizard. We'll go ahead and create a new SharePoint app. And this is going to be provider hosted. So I mentioned here that you have some options here. Again, these are the same thing that are on-prem. I've got SharePoint host, provider hosted and SharePoint hosted. SharePoint hosted is going to be JavaScript only, and that's going to be specifically for hosting your JavaScript sites. In this case, this is a provider hosted talk, so we're going to create a SharePoint hosted app. No, we're not going to do that. All right. Up here is where I'm going to plug in my developer site. So what I'm doing is I'm pointing to my developer site collection that I just created. If I'm on-premise, this would be my on-premise developer site collection. If I'm in the cloud, I'm going to point to my cloud developer site collection. So go ahead and click Next. And here, what type of project do I want to create? Do I want an MVC application, or do I want a web forms app? We're going to create a very simple app, so we'll just create a web forms app. Now here, we mentioned earlier about token types, right? There's ACS, and then there's these high-trust apps. When you're on-premise, most of the apps you're going to create are going to be high-trust apps. Very few customers actually create what are called low-trust apps on-premise. You do have that option, however, to do that. What that does is, really behind the scenes, and we'll talk more about this later on, but in general, this is how your app is actually going to be trusted to be in your environment. When you're on-premise, it's going to be trusted by a certificate. When you're in the cloud, it's going to be trusted by something that's common, something that everyone can get to, both Office 365 and your provider-hosted app. In that case, it's ACS. We'll show you some other examples later on where we're looking at Azure Active Directory as being that token provider or that trusted source. So here we'll click Finish. We'll go ahead and authenticate to our Office 365 app. All right, so there we've authenticated to our Office 365 tenant. It's going to go ahead and create a new project for us, and it's going to pull down some files, and let's take a quick tour of those files. Go, gadget, go. All right, here we go. All right, what do we have here? So we have one project, and we have two projects. What are these two projects? That top project there with the S, that is the SharePoint project. That is what gets deployed to SharePoint, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. That's the part that, when I talked about the app web, that's the part that's going to help work with my app web, provision my app web, put my content types, my list definitions, and so on and so forth into my app web. That second project there, the one with the little globe, that's my ASP.NET project, and that's the one that's going to actually be the provider. That's the one that's going to be the web project that provides the functionality that my SharePoint app is going to use. And in here is pretty familiar. It's just ASP.NET. We got some HTML in there. So we'll say hello from Ignite. All right, we'll take a quick tour of something else here. All right, so here, what I clicked on was the app manifest. And the app manifest is what describes what the application is actually trying to do. Where do I go to actually launch this particular application? So what we're pointing to here is I'm pointing to my start page. That start page would be a public site when you're going live. It's my private local host now. And then we have a set of permissions that we could potentially ask for. We'll talk more about those permissions later on, but I just wanted to give you the tour while we're here. All right, we'll go ahead and click F5. Not browse with. Cancel. Start. All right, so what's happening here? Behind the scenes, what we're doing is we're registering our application with SharePoint. We're getting authorization to actually make calls in the SharePoint. And it's going to go ahead and launch our app. We're going to go out to our Office 365 environment here. We will authenticate. All right, so now we're back. And here it's saying, do you trust this app? This is part of the OAuth consent. Again, we'll talk deeper into what this actually means, but here it's just saying, hey, you're about to deploy this app and it's about to ask and do these things. Is that okay? Click trust it. And then, all right, we see our hello from Ignite, but the other thing that we see is our URL. So what happened? Your Visual Studio then deployed this to SharePoint. SharePoint looked at that start URL and says, where do I go for this particular application? That start URL was localhost, redirected me over to localhost. It's resolving because I'm on the machine. So that's just a quick tour of the project types and what happens behind the scenes for a provider-hosted app.
Go back to slides.
Yep.
All right, so that's a little bit of the setup and just understanding the schematics of what a provider-hosted app project is, right? And what we're going to end up getting to is when I'm finished building this, I'm going to go and send that website out somewhere. I'm going to go deploy it to and it could be anywhere in the world. I could have my SharePoint farm that is in your data center in Dallas, Texas, and I could go deploy that website in Singapore, and I can have that all function. And that's one of the unique benefits of this new add-in model is that we've truly decoupled how this works. So when I go to build it, the benefit is, from a build standpoint, I can use anything that the web enables me to use. Truly anything that you want to use on the web, right? And in the past, as a SharePoint developer, just doing something as simple as using like Silverlight in a page was a challenging thing to do. Now we're really trying to make it to where you could truly use whatever technology you want on the web. And so as we go into looking at this, the first thing we do need to do is how I might surface a user interface within these applications. So just as a quick reminder, we can do a full page application. We can do what we call an app part. We can extend the SharePoint user interface through commands, so things like contextual menus or ribbon buttons. And we can also leverage the SharePoint dialog. There's a lot of different ways that SharePoint dialog can be leveraged, from launching a site provisioning wizard to something as simple as grabbing a tiny URL when we go to build that. Another thing that we can start to do is look at different ways that I might have that user interface blend in so that it looks like it's a part of SharePoint. So if you think about things like the web part that was on that page, if you're new to provider-hosted apps, you may not recognize it, but that web part is basically an iframe. It's kind of an iframe on steroids in a lot of ways, but it's basically an iframe framing up some web page you have running somewhere else. So immediately I think of things like, well, am I going to see scroll bars all the time if things resize, or am I going to have it look like it has the same types of styles? And so what we're going to find is that I'm going to have the ability to have that really nicely blend in when I go and I build my app out here. So we're going to be able to blend that in through a number of different ways. So first of all, we're going to have what we call a Chrome control. And a Chrome control basically says if I have a full-page application, I might want to just give the appearance, the outside kind of frame of the normal SharePoint master page. And so that's something that we provide that you could very easily add to your page. So it's as simple as adding a little div to the top of your page, and then as the page loads, you pull in a little script and just say that this is where I want that Chrome control to get rendered. So that's one of the things. That helps you integrate things like navigation. It gives you a really nice field so that a user doesn't feel like they're leaving SharePoint and going somewhere else. It really just feels like an application page, and the only way they would be able to tell is if they looked at that URL. There's other ways we can also integrate themes and styles. So I can point out to my host site and say, hey, go give me your style sheet. You might have some crazy style sheet that's pink and purple and blinking, and I want to reference that so that my web part looks pink and purple and blinks too. And so I can very easily reach out, even if I'm not using the Chrome control, I can use that so that it all looks good together. The final thing is, when you think about things like the app parts, it is a framed element, and what happens if the data in it grows? What happens there? So we provide you a mechanism to say, hey, I need more room. So you can actually have your page request more space on the page that it's hosted on through a post-message communication, and we'll take a look at that. Some of the other things is we've done a lot of work to try to provide very native-looking controls. So if you want to build different forms and different elements within your HTML, you can leverage a number of our controls. So we have things like people pickers, list views. We have a taxonomy picker that's out in the patterns and practices group that you can go and pull down and leverage within your site. But the other great thing is you don't have to make it look like SharePoint. If you have a really well put together site of your own and you just maybe want some hooks into SharePoint, you don't have to go with that Chrome control. You can really make it any way that you want. Or maybe provide some sort of hybrid between the two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about 10 minutes showing you a few of the things that we can build inside of our provider-hosted app, and then how I can make it start looking like a true part of SharePoint. So I've ultimately just done the exact same thing that Israel did. I have a blank SharePoint provider-hosted app project. And just to really kind of nail the point home is you can tell this is a provider-hosted app because it has two projects. A SharePoint-hosted app is always just going to have one project unless you were to add some other thing to it. But this is kind of the default experience. Is you're going to have the web project and you're going to have the SharePoint project in here. Now, I can add elements to either one of these. If I need SharePoint things, like maybe I need a module, or I need a page, or a workflow, or any sort of thing that SharePoint can store for me, I'm going to add that to this top project. So I can come in here and add a number of different things. I'll come in here and do things like, I could add a new column, I could add a content type, I could add things like a ribbon command. Here's where I could add things like a web part, what we call a client web part here. So there's a number of different types of components that I could add into the site. So where we started with our Tiny URLs app was in a ribbon button. So I'll come out here and say, let's create a ribbon custom action. And it's going to say, what type of, how do you want to scope this? Do you want to put it on the host web or the app web? And this can be a confusing thing, the difference between the app web and the host web. Ultimately, what happens is when you install one of these add-ins, we actually create a subsite for it. So a subsite gets created underneath wherever you're installing it. And the reason we do it as a subsite is if you ever want to get rid of that add-in, it's very easy to just clean it up just by deleting that whole subsite. So that's kind of the mechanism. So when we see host site versus, or host web versus app web, that app web is that little subsite that's just specific. It's the sandbox just for your application. And so what this is saying is, where do you want the custom action to show up? Do you want it to be in the sandbox, or do you want it to be in the site you're actually installing the add-in for? So I'm going to go ahead and say we will do the host web. And I'm going to say I want this for maybe a specific list template, and I want to target maybe a document library. The next thing is it's going to say, where do you want it to be located in the ribbon? Now, I can actually build an entire ribbon. So if I were to go, just zoom out here and go to like my root site in this tenant, what you'll find is I have an add-in installed from DocuSign, who's a really popular partner with Microsoft. And you can see that I have an entire DocuSign ribbon. So they haven't just added a few buttons to the ribbon. They add their whole entire tab to the ribbon. So you have that sort of flexibility when you add these custom actions. But for the sake of our little tiny links app, I'm simply going to select maybe a specific area. So you can see I have a number of different areas I can target this. Maybe I want to do the ribbon share. So this would be like sharing a link. So I'm going to go ahead and select ribbon share. I can specify the title of our that's going to be underneath the text. I'll just call this Hello Ignite. And then I can say finish. At this point, this looks identical to a ribbon configuration you would have done in full trust code land or in a sandbox solution. It's really the same schema that you're leveraging here. There's a few additional things that I can do in this, but for the most part, this is identical to what you might have doing that in traditionally. So I can add other things here. If I wanted to add maybe a client-side app part, I can go in and add things like that. So I'll go in and say add new item, and I can simply add a new client-side web part. That might be the host. What it's going to say, what page do you want to load in here? We'll create a new page for you, or we can reference an existing page that you already have. So I could reuse like my default.aspx page here if I wanted to, and just say finish. Now another reason I call these app parts an iframe on steroids is because I can specify custom web part properties on this. So you can see I have things like a default height and width. That's going to be kind of the default size that it gets loaded in. But I can come in here and put various properties if I wanted to. So I can put custom properties for, maybe I want a user to put, maybe this is a weather app and I want to put a zip code so that it can go look up weather and display within that app part. So that's some of the user interface things, but there's a lot of really powerful things that aren't apparent when you just look at the slide that we like to show here, the slide that shows a bunch of shapes. Go back here really quickly. Oh. So if you just took provider-hosted apps for this list of things, I think you'd really be doing it an injustice. I make a pretty bold statement that I think just about anything you're doing today in full trust code on your SharePoint servers, you could probably redeliver using this new add-in model. You might just have to rethink the way you're doing that. And that's really what spawned one of our big initiatives within Microsoft, which is the Microsoft SharePoint Patterns and Practices group. Is anyone familiar with the patterns and practices? Awesome. Has anyone pulled that down and started using any of it? Cool. So there are hundreds of samples out there that show you how to do all kinds of things from branding to provisioning to modifying the existing user interface in some way through like a script injection. So there's a number of different things that we can do that don't necessarily fit directly into one of these shapes. I'll give you a really good example of one. I think this one is a really compelling demo. Is in the feature framework, which is kind of what we consider full trust code, you had the concept of doing something called a feature receiver. Anyone worked with feature receivers before? So the idea behind a feature receiver is when someone activates my feature, I want to be able to run some code, do some things, kind of do some additional functionality. We can do those types of things in here, which give us the ability to do almost anything we want to our host web that we're putting our app inside of. So all I have to do there is on the project itself, the SharePoint project, if you look down here at the bottom, there's a few what we call remote events. So I can be notified as the app is being installed, uninstalled, or updated. So I'm going to show you what happens when I actually do this. So I'm going to quickly just come out here and say, let's listen to when the app gets installed. As soon as I do that, it's going to add for me a WCF service to my web project. So it added a WCF service. If you look at this WCF service uses a very specific interface, this thing called an iRemote event service. What this is going to give us the ability to do is that when someone installs this application, whatever SharePoint farm it's getting installed in will go call this WCF endpoint and say, hey, this app is getting installed and here's the contextual information around it. From there I could go and do other things. I might activate a master page or copy some files into the host web or create some list. Really anything that you have permission to do, you could do in this remote event. The other cool thing here is that we provide you a really nice mechanism for debugging these. So I'll just put a breakpoint here. And what I'm going to do is, using localhost, I'm going to go and actually deploy this out into SharePoint Online. Now, there's things that we can do to do this with SharePoint on premises, but I think the impressive thing here is SharePoint Online, because I'm sitting here behind a firewall here in this conference. I don't have any sort of static IP, and I'm going to have SharePoint Online call my local host service. That's pretty impressive.
I think so.
Let's see if it works. So what we're doing behind the scenes here is we're leveraging some technologies in Azure called a service bus, so that I can listen on this bus for information, and when SharePoint wants to talk to me, it can. So I'm going to go ahead and say I trust this app. It's going to install. It's going to attach to the debugger right off the bat. And if everything is happy, I should hit a breakpoint here in just a moment as it gets added to my SharePoint site. So it's in the process of installing.
Wait for it.
These are always a little bit dangerous on conference internet.
Wait for it.
I'll give it to 45 seconds in. If it doesn't hit, we'll move on.
Stay on target. Star Wars reference.
Oh, there we go. We got an error. Oh, yep, we got an error. It wasn't able to hit our remote event receiver. So looks like there may have been an issue with the remote connection through Service Bus on here. The idea is that we do provide more advanced things, right? We can do feature is probably a bad word, but app installation events, app uninstall events. We can know when items are added to list items. So we have remote events for list items. So when things get added or deleted, we can actually call out to these service endpoints and be able to process those here within these applications. Now, I'm going to quickly jump back over to our Tiny Links app that we did at the beginning. And I did one quick thing. I removed the Chrome control because I want to show you what it looks like with and without that Chrome control to go and put that within one of your sites. So I'm just going to launch this up here really quickly, and it's going to go into the full page experience. And it's going to look very, very plain with like no styling. So you can see I have a grid view here where I have my headers and I have my individual tiny links that we've generated, but it certainly looks nothing like SharePoint. So if I were back on the actual site and I went to launch my Small Links app, I'll just click my and actually if we go down here, it looks really bad down in this app part. It's all scroll bars all over the place. But if I were to now go and click on this Small Links app, it's going to take a user out here and they're going to be like, huh? What just happened? I'm lost. Right? So that Chrome control is going to be a really important component, and we make it very easy for you to implement. So I'm here on this page that I just used, and all I have to do is add this one div. And you could call it anything you want. I called it div SP Chrome. But you basically are going to just put a div element at the top of your page. And then we're going to add just a little bit of script. So the only thing I need to kind of light this up is to add reference to this thing called UX scripts. This is something that we have in a number of the patterns and practices samples. It's in all the samples I have out on my blog. It's basically just a reusable script to handle things like the Chrome control. So if I go in here, basically what I'm doing is I'm getting some contextual information about, hey, what's the host web and the app web? Because SharePoint's going to pass that to me. Anytime I launch one of these apps, it's going to pass me the contextual information that I need to run it. I'm then going to go reference a few scripts. And one of the scripts I'm going to use is this spui.controls.js. That is what's going to build that Chrome control for me. So I basically could just say, hey, once this is done loading, go actually render the Chrome. And so rendering the Chrome is really simple. I just create I get reference to that div control, and I just instantiate a new navigation control within that element. So it's only like 2 lines of code to go and put that Chrome control on the page. The other thing I like to do is sometimes it'll take a little bit for that to load. So a little tip that I'd recommend is to set the style of your body to be hidden until it loads. And the only reason for that is it's kind of ugly when styles start to toggle on the screen. Your user's like, whoa, what just happened? It just like flickered, and now it looks good. It looked horrible for a second. So now what happens if I go and launch this application? Just by adding those two little things, referencing our script and marking the body to be invisible at first. When we go into our app, it might take a second, it's going to be blank, but now we have our nice looking Chrome, and it has all the same kind of hover styles of the exact SharePoint site we came from. One other thing I'll point out here is that same UX scripts also handles the resizing of the app parts that are on this page. So if I scroll down here to the bottom of this page, what you'll see is, whoa, what just happened? Must have hit something. If I go down to the bottom of this page, what we'll find is that I no longer have scroll bars and I have the same nice styling. It's actually the exact same page. We just have a little flag that says, hey, am I displaying it in full screen or am I displaying it in an app part? That's the only difference between it. It's the exact same page that's being loaded between those two experiences. Cool.
Yep. The clicker broke.
Oh, that's right.
Broken.
And we're right here.
Yep, clicker broken. All right, so let's look at what it takes to actually secure your add-in. That's one of my favorite pictures, by the way. It's a tricycle. All right, so add-ins. How do they talk to each other? Add-ins require OAuth. We had some color commentary earlier around OAuth. And OAuth is a security mechanism for communication between your app and SharePoint. It's an app-to-app communication. OAuth is an authorization framework that helps you to help with that communication. And it's really to help your app talk to another app without the user being present. Right? That's really what that's for. The main components behind that is registration. We have to have some type of registration component to actually say, here's my app identifier, and here's the way that I'm going to help validate that communication is secure between these two things. That's represented as a client ID and a shared secret. That's the registration part of it. The other part of it is the permissions. The permissions have to do with what is it that you're actually asking to do. In some cases, you're not asking to do anything, right? I just want to authenticate. But in other cases, I might need access to a list. I might need access to a web or a site collection. So that's where the permissions and scopes come in. And the consent is being able to say, yes, I accept it, or no, I do not. So yes is part of that consent process. And then there's ongoing access. Well, what happens after I've said yes? How does my application then continue to communicate with SharePoint? And how do I, as an end user, decide to remove that particular permission? Right? So then there's ongoing access. There's 3 tokens that really get passed around there. One is the context. Richard talked about it earlier. When you navigate to a provider-hosted site, SharePoint gives you context. It says, here's where the user is actually launching from. And that allows your app to say, can I get a token for that particular site that the user just launched me from? That particular token is going to come from either ACS, it's going to come from Azure Active Directory, or if you're on-premise, it's going to be a certificate, in which case the access is already provided for you because you've created that certificate trust between the two. So on the side of I need to continue to have access, as long as that certificate is valid, and as long as I can talk to that particular application with that certificate, then everything's going to be okay. On the web, I'm going to get an access token and a refresh token. An access token just gives me access, right? It says, yes, this particular application, that particular context, and that particular user, and that particular app, these are all still valid. You are allowed to do what it was that you wanted to do. And along those lines, add-ins do respect the user security. So if the human is actually interacting with your particular app, SharePoint's going to respect the user security. So the app isn't going to be able to go above what the user has permissions to, even if the app has asked for additional permissions. So for example, if the app operates at a site collection level, but the user that's interacting with it only has rights to the particular web, then his permissions, the permissions of the app, are actually going to be restricted to that user, so the app is actually going to come down. The inverse is also true. If the app has asked for site collection permission and the user interacting with the app has site collection permission, then the app is going to have those same permissions, and it's going to operate on that user security. There are opportunities for you to configure your app to say, I don't want to use the user, I actually want to use the permissions. So this is, on-premise, you would call this elevating permissions. This is what's called an app-only context, where the app is going to ask for a set of permissions. I want to operate on your site collection. Someone's going to say it's okay. So in order for you to grant that permission, the user has to have that permission. So the administrator is going to say, yes, I allow it. Once that user allows it, then the app can then turn around and say, I want to talk to SharePoint, and by the way, I've already been granted permission in an app-only context, that is without a human being present. All right, so that's what we mean by app-only, and there are different ways to configure the app-only context.
Do a lot of y'all use run with elevated permissions and things that you're building today with SharePoint?
Yep. So this would be a way for you to do that. The permissions don't map exactly one-to-one, but it's a way for you to do that in an app-only context. What we want to provide here was just a quick grid to talk about those different components: the registration, permissions, consent, and ongoing access. And here, for registration, if you're on premises, you're going to register your app using appreg.new.aspx. It's a page that's already hosted on your SharePoint site. If you're in the cloud, Office 365, same page, _layouts /15/appreg.new.aspx. In order to grant permissions to that particular application, those permissions are going to be on that page, appinv.aspx, same thing in the cloud. For Azure, you're going to be doing all of your registration and all of your management, and if you're going to access it using the Office 365 APIs, you're going to be doing all the registration, all the permission management in Azure. As far as consent, you're going to get a prompt. It's going to say, hey, this app wants to do X. Is this okay? You're going to click OK. That was the prompt that you saw earlier, the trust prompt. And then for ongoing access, if you're on premises, low trust, you're going to create a connection with your farm to Office 365 ACS, because that's what's used to validate the tokens. That's the third party that's actually in that relationship. You can also do high trust applications, which is a certificate. So the certificate is what's going to be used to sign the tokens to make sure that you are you. Right? That's really what that's for the signature side. For Office 365, you're going to be using ACS to sign the tokens. And for Office 365 APIs, you're going to be using Azure Active Directory to actually sign those tokens. And the ongoing access there for high trust apps, not available for Office 365, and it's also not available for Azure Active Directory because all that's managed within there. So there's no high trust app equivalent. As far as registering, here's what that AppReg New looks like. You're going to push the button, click Create, or if you have your own GUID, bring your own GUID. You can plug it into the client ID, generate a shared secret for yourself, and then add some information about your app. So that's how you register your app. What you're doing is you're saying, hey, SharePoint, I'd like to communicate with you, and please provide me an identifier that you can use to identify me, and I can use to identify me as well. On the permission side, that's a screenshot of appinv. You're going to plug your client ID in there, push lookup. It's going to pull your client ID, and you're going to be able to pop in your permission scope. We'll talk more about the format of that permission scope in a sec. The other thing that's happening, they are starting to change this, right? Most of the registration started off in SharePoint. Most of it had to do with timing based on what was available at the time, but most of this is currently moving. So it is also moving more towards the Azure Active Directory route for registration. On-prem, this is going to be the same. This button will not exist for you on-prem. In the cloud, this will be coming for registration of your app and management of your permissions in Azure Active Directory. When you're looking at registering your provider-hosted app, let's say you're in Azure. If you are in Azure, you're going to click Add an organization, add an app my organization is developing. It's going to generate a client ID for you. You're going to push the button. It's going to create a shared secret for you. Little hint, when you click the button and generates a shared secret for you, you've got to copy that shared secret because it will not show it to you again. You can always generate more, but you will not see that again. And a lot of it is for security. If you're working with a lot of third-party applications like Twitter, Google, Facebook, and so on, similar mechanism. I get a client ID shared secret. I get that client ID shared secret. I plug it into my app. That's what allows my two applications to actually talk to each other. Yes, sir. Question.
Only when you're ready to deploy to production, because I didn't see any of that during the dev. Is that because it's not required when you're doing the dev?
So the question is, yeah. So the question is, during dev, do I have to do this? Because I didn't see you guys do this. Is this only for production? So Rich is going to show you how to actually take the app from development to production by taking those steps. Behind the scenes, Visual Studio takes care of this for you. So if you saw some of those steps when it was deploying the app, getting client ID, generating permissions, behind the scenes, it's actually making calls and doing that registration for you. So the tooling is helping us out here.
Yeah, if you had your web config open, like every time you went to debug, you'd get the little prompt that says your web config is updated because it's putting the new ID and secret in there.
Right, and that's for SharePoint registration. For Azure registration, this is the once you're registered, that's it. That's your client ID, and you don't have to use it anymore.
Has anyone? I'm just out of curiosity. Has anyone built apps that connect with Azure AD?
Azure AD, a few folks. All right, folks in there. Give that man a T-shirt. Give that man a T-shirt. Over there. All right, so for add-in permissions, what we wanted to do was just compare the experience between SharePoint permissions and the Azure Active Directory permissions. So here what we have is INV, appinv.aspx. I'm going to plug in my client ID, and I'm going to put a permission request. It's basically an XML blob that I'm going to drop in there, just XML components, that are going to say, here's what my app actually wants to do as part of that registration. As a comparison, on the Azure AD side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a set of services, and then on another screen, I'm actually going to say, here's what I want to interact with for those particular services, and here are the permissions that I need for those different services. So a quick comparison, on that XML blob, I've got a scope URI of what I want to do. I want to talk to a site collection. It's going to say SharePoint/content/site collection. If I want to talk to a list, it's going to say SharePoint/content/list. So that's on the SharePoint side. As a comparison, Azure AD scopes are a little different. Some of it is a little more granular, some of it is less granular. We'll have a pros and cons on the different ones. I just wanted to show you the difference between the two different scopes. For app only, when you're doing SharePoint, when you're registering it with SharePoint, you're going to have your app permissions. You're going to specify app only equals true, and that's going to allow your app to get a app only context. It's going to allow the app to use the client ID and shared secret to authenticate, as opposed to the user that's going to authenticate, interacting with it. As a comparison, on the Azure AD side, there's actually another scope, another box. In Azure AD, there are two boxes. One is for application, and one is for your the actual scope of the delegated privilege. So in this case here, the application permission is going to be your app only in Azure AD. So that's a comparison between those two types of scopes.
And those are brand new, by the way. We haven't provided that capability in Azure AD until just last week. The interesting thing there is it's kind of similar to how you set up high trust apps. You actually use certificates to do the trust there. So if you've done the on-premises work, it's very, very similar.
Yep. So how do I select, right? How do I choose between building things today versus building things over the next 3 to 6 months, over the next year, or so on? You confuse me. How do I understand the difference, right? The big thing to think about is really around capabilities. What is it that I'm trying to do? If I'm just interacting with a SharePoint site today, and my app was going to be, my add-in is going to be built within the next 3 to 6 months, then I'm going to do SharePoint registration. The Azure AD stuff is great to know for later. If I'm looking 6 months, 9 months out, then I'm probably going to be moving more towards the Azure AD route, because that's the direction that they're moving for the cloud. On-premise, Azure AD isn't an option for you. All of your permissions are going to be based on certificates on-premise. So the Azure AD part actually doesn't even apply to you on-premise. This is more for cloud deployments. There's some pros and cons there. We can talk about that later on, but we just wanted to provide that there. If you have any questions around this decision-making, we can pick it up afterwards.
So maybe I'm going to go a little bit off script here, just because it looked like we did have a decent amount of people that raised their hand around on-premises. So maybe talking a little bit about, maybe we can talk a little bit about the process for kind of configuring some of that on-premises. Do you want to do that now?
Sure. So we'll talk so quickly. On-premises, when you're building SharePoint hosted apps. In the cloud, when you build SharePoint hosted apps, what happens behind the scenes is your app actually gets run in a random location. You get a GUID, you get an app, and that's where your app actually runs for SharePoint hosted apps. That's where your JavaScript then gets hosted, and that's where your JavaScript gets run. On premises, SharePoint hosted, and I'm spending time to emphasize on that because I'm clarified in a second. On-prem, SharePoint hosted, you have to have a wildcard certificate because you don't know where that app is actually going to be running. SharePoint generates that app ID for you. On-prem, SharePoint hosted. You also need a certificate for the provider-hosted part, but on the backside, you need a way for your servers to actually communicate to each other, and that's going to be the server-to-server communication for the next part I'm going to talk about, which is provider-hosted. So SharePoint hosted, wacky GUID. I need a DNS to actually point to it. I need a wildcard DNS because SharePoint will generate that URL for me. SharePoint hosted.
Yeah, and maybe to expand on a few other things, right? There's also a specific service application. There's an app management service application that needs to be in place, a subscription service that needs to be in place that ultimately identifies your tenancy, which for most on-premises customers is a single one. But we have really good guidance that walks you through that. The one thing I would point out that is key is if you look at how we do OAuth for apps or add-ins,
Yeah,
you just got shocked.
I know.
If you look at how we do that, the first time I looked at OAuth, and it was before SharePoint, it was when I first started doing things with like Facebook apps. I was like, oh my gosh, all the passing around of different tokens and things like that. On premises, it's actually really simple. The app has what we would consider the private key portion of a certificate. It creates its own access tokens in a sense. Yeah. It basically says, I'm going to create my own access token, and I'm going to sign it with this certificate that the server has the public token side of it. So because they share that token, basically there's no like popping around that has to occur. It's really simple. Now, you get certificates in the mix, and a lot of people immediately think, oh, it's really complex. And maybe setting up that first certificate isn't as immediate as we might want it to be. But actually, the way it functions is a lot easier when it's on premises.
Yep. The other thing to note is on premises, it's really one web app per service app, one app catalog per web app, so that's how it gets all wired up together. So I spent the time talking about SharePoint hosted. We jumped over to provider hosted. For provider hosted apps, exactly what Richard said. I've got a certificate with a private key. I sign the tokens. I tell SharePoint who the user is. I tell SharePoint that I'm going to access it. And SharePoint says, oh, here's a token. Do I have the key for that? Can I open the certificate? And if I can validate the certificate, I then take the cert, I take the data, I sign it, and if it matches, then this token must be still valid.
And I guess one last thing I would say is if you first looked at building add-ins when we first announced this, I will apologize. I will apologize for Microsoft that our guidance and our tooling really wasn't there so much for the on-premises scenarios. We've since created new helpers that make it very, very easy. In fact, it's just the way I get my tokens is just one different method call. It's basically, I can say I want to get access token for SharePoint, for SharePoint host or via S2S. So it's very, very easy to do that, both from a user permissions and an app-only permissions. All right, well, let's jump into ship it. We're going to ship our app. I want to show you how easy it is for us to deploy one of these applications and how I might go about doing that. So how we go about doing that is Visual Studio really creates that easy deployment. Now, if I was building my application in another platform, I could certainly do packaging manually if I needed to, but Visual Studio will certainly make it easy for me. In fact, in a lot of ways, I would say if you're going to do building an app in another platform, you actually might be better off just deploying if it's PHP, deploying your PHP site and still using Visual Studio for packaging the rest. You're just putting the URL. All the app needs to know is what the URL it's starting in is. So this is the wizard you get. You basically go out and you can pick a web publishing profile. That could be something that is you've configured manually, where you do like set up an FTP type deployment. You could go get an Azure deployment package to very easily do that. You'll deploy your website, and then you'll create the side of it that you're going to let SharePoint know about. Or if you were building this for the store, you'd go out and give to the Microsoft to validate. So here's where some of those keys get involved. I'm sitting here like trying to move slides on my computer. This is where some of those keys get involved. Is I'm going to go and specify, first of all, where is my site hosted? So what URL is it at? What domain can I go and access that app in? And then what's the client ID that I got from that AppRegNew page? So I need to go to AppRegNew first to get that.
Yep, it's a cut and paste there. Apologize. That top one should say URL.
Yep. So once I do that, I then can simply just drag and drop the package into a SharePoint list. There's a special type of site in SharePoint called an app catalog. Israel mentioned it, but it's just a site template. It's a site template that has a few special types of list configured in it for application manifest files. So let's take a look. I think I could probably deploy an entire app end to end in probably 3 minutes. So let's try that. Look at the clock. All right. So I'm going to first go get a website. I'm going to use Azure just because I work for Microsoft and I get free Azure. And so I'm going to go create one of these. We'll just call this Ignite Provider. And I'll say create web app. The cool thing about these websites in Azure, they scale incredibly well. And they also give me free HTTPS, so I don't have to go buy an SSL cert. And let me tell you, if you're doing apps, add-ins, you want to be doing things over SSL. You're passing tokens around that if it got intercepted, someone could do something malicious with. So we're going to go ahead and download this publishing profile. So it just downloaded it here. And now I can take this TinyLinks app that's still running and go deploy it. So I'll just go up here and we'll say publish. And here's our wizard. You can see the first thing it says is we need a profile. So I'll say a new profile. I could configure something manually, but what I'm going to do is just browse out to that publishing profile. Here it is, Ignite Provider. I'll click Next. It wants an app ID and secret. So what I need to do is go out and generate that. So what I'm going to do, you can generate them anywhere. I like to do it off my app catalog. So I usually go to /apps and then do _layouts. /15/app reg new. There we go. We'll say generate client ID, generate client secret. We'll give it a title. Some of this really doesn't matter. I'll just say tiny links or small links. What's that? No.
So the question is, does the title mean anything? It doesn't line up with the app manifest. That's correct. So the title is just a way to allow you to distinguish your app from another app. The one that is important, in some cases, is going to be the app domain and the redirect URI. Those are the ones where if it's validating the OAuth token on the other side, it wants to make sure that this actual token, this claim set, actually belongs to you. Right? So those are the ones that are a little bit important if you're doing provider-hosted apps. A question over here? I'm sorry?
If you've got multiple tenancies, you've got a dev tenancy, a test tenancy, a production tenancy, 365, etc. Have you got to create one of these each time you move across? Is there a good other
Okay, so the question is, if I have a ALM scenario where I'm moving something from dev test to prod, do I have to do this every time? Do I have to register my application every single time? You do have to register it. You don't have to generate a new client ID, right? As long as your GUIDs don't clash, which should not happen theoretically. But no, you can generate one client ID, one shared secret, and then move that along. Most of the times you're going to want those to be separate anyway as you move to production. You don't want the same client ID shared secret used for all of them. So you might get a new client ID for production. You're going to package it, and redo it for the production build. But no, you don't have to. You can use the same client ID shared secret, just make sure it's registered on all the different environments.
So all I did was go in and generate that client ID and secret. You can see it here, so if someone wants to copy that down really quick, I didn't really give it many permissions. We'll talk about that here. Or we talked about it a little bit, but this really doesn't have many permissions to it. But I'm already in the process of publishing this out to Azure, so it's I can go and say deploy web project. It'll bring up that wizard. I'll simply say publish. Should only take a couple seconds for it to get published out to that website. And then I can go and package the app and put it in my catalog. So there it goes. It's basically generating the deployment package, and it's done. So now I'll go and say package the app. You can see down here it's giving me a little validation. It's saying, hey, you need to do HTTPS. Well, the good thing is that this endpoint actually supports HTTPS, so I just have to give it the yes there. And you notice that it has the app ID as well, because this is what I'm going to go give SharePoint. I'll say finish. It's going to just generate for me this .app file. This is basically, it has all the things that I might need in SharePoint, so like it's declarative things, all declarative things. It's going to be declarative things like any sort of lists or modules that I'm getting created. But it also contains my manifest. And all I have to do now to make this app available to people in my org is come to this app catalog, drag and drop, and it is now theoretically deployed. Now, the cool thing about this app catalog is it's just a SharePoint list, so if I wanted to limit the permissions of any of these apps, I can simply just change the permissions. I can do role-based permission on the list item, and that determines whether or not a user can add that app or not. But if I were to go now to any other site, we'll go just maybe to, just go to my root, and say site content, add an app. You can see right there is small links that I can go and add to this site. I'll go ahead and click on it. It'll take just a moment for it to just say yes, it has access, and it'll finish provisioning. The other cool thing is, let's say I need to make an update to Tiny Links to our site. Maybe I want to capture something else. If all I'm changing is the website, I can just go and redeploy the website. SharePoint doesn't even have to know that anything occurred. There's no recycling of an app pool. I mean, this is way, way cleaner from a deployment standpoint compared to WSPs.
All right, any questions on that process?
Yep. C2. We'll go here and then here.
So if you redeploy your app, it's transparent, but is there any way that you can protect? Is there versioning so I can know that just if I want to test?
So you certainly, there's two sides that can be like updated, right? I could update just the remote web part that again is running on some web server somewhere. But if I didn't, let's say I needed to add something new or maybe a new permission, right? If for me to get permission to an additional thing that I didn't originally have access to, that requires a change to that app manifest. So I would version it, and I'd put a new version out in the app catalog, and it would show up for anyone that hasn't installed. Just like when your phone has a new update for a phone, you see a little indicator that says, hey, there's a new version of this app. Do you want to pull it down now? And then there's some ways to centrally push that out, but in general, it's either way. But I think the cool thing for me is if I don't need to change anything around permissioning or adding new things to that SharePoint site, I can really just update independently. So I actually have apps that I have thousands of users around the globe using that I can go push an update at night, and I don't even have to like let them know what happened. I can just do it, manage it. Yep.
I've done some app development for on-premise SharePoint, and there's a problem when you publish your app to the app catalog. Things like endpoints and custom actions start, they don't host them.
So what you're talking about is.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. So when you go and deploy something through the app catalog, there's some issues where some things aren't available. So what that is this is a little bit more of a complex concept, but there's two things I can do inside of that app catalog. I can go and register. I can make the app available to the org, Or I can even go in there and I can push it out to sites. I can deploy it centrally from there, where I can say, hey, everything that's a team site, everything that uses the team site template now gets this app. And you are absolutely correct that that concept of pushing that out to everyone doesn't work if it has an app part in it. Yeah, and that we're aware of that. It's in something that's in our backlog to try to make available at some point in time. But today, you're right. You can't do that. So here's the difference, right? Do you mind?
Nope, I don't mind.
So the difference is, all I did in the app catalog was just make it available to people. I didn't try to force it on them. Now there's a way that I can force it on them. If I go out here to back to the app catalog, you will only see this option in the app catalog, by the way. But if I go here, you actually first have to install the app in the app catalog. So I have one that's Easy Quiz app here. So you see this Easy Quiz app? If I wanted all team sites to have access to the Easy Quiz app, I can come in here and I can say Manage Deployment. That option is not anywhere else in SharePoint, only on this template. But if I click Deployment, I can go out here and say I want Easy Quiz to be on everything, or specific sites, specific managed paths, or even specific templates. I can push it out there. Now, it's a little bit deceiving in saying push it out there, because all it does is reference the app that's installed centrally, and that's why app parts don't work. That's right. Yeah, it's all pointing back to this one. I did a blog post when these first came out that I called app stapling. It's kind of a similar, that's kind of caught on, but I don't know that it's the official term for it. But yeah, it's a very similar concept.
Got like a few more slides, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the last part of this is, how do I improve upon it, right? So the one question you want to ask yourself is, how will users actually launch my application? So you saw Richard launching it from the site contents, right? So they go into site contents, and then once they've added it, they launch it from a link. But there's other ways to actually launch this application. Once we have it, there's in Office 365, you have an Azure AD app launcher. So any app that gets deployed for an end user, they actually have it available to them where they can go to the app launcher and actually pin it to that waffle up above there. They can pin it there, and they can launch it very quickly from their from their site, from the little waffle up there. So that's another way to help the users interact with the app. Yes, sir?
How would you be able to include the top part in your custom provider app, just so that it's the same sort of switching?
Yeah, good question. So that is
That guy gets a T-shirt for asking a question we're not going to answer.
So the question is we've recently changed the Chrome, and the Chrome control hasn't caught up. I mean, I think that's the ultimate question, right? So yeah, we're aware of that. If you guys know Chax, he's on the Modern Portals team. He's been here all week. That's kind of like it's one of the top things on their list, is to try to make that update. Because if you sat through things like now, I don't know that we have it completely disclosed and visible in terms of what this will look like on premises, but if you were in any of the keynotes where we got glimpses of SharePoint Server 2016, we have a similar concept in the Chrome of that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of effort that's being done to try to get that updated.
Yep. So we're adding here a set of related sessions. Some of these are in the past, so if you have your time machine handy, you can go back in time, or just go back on Channel 9. There's all these videos are going to be available online, so you can go back and watch them. Some other related sessions, also some related labs. So if you want to get a chance to do this before you take off, because I know it's the last day, but you can go in and actually build some of these on your own. The other thing we have here is the developer program. So definitely sign up. When you do sign up, there is a free developer site, free Office 365 developer site for 1 year, which is something that used to cost $99 US, and now you actually get it for free. So you're able to, if you sign up there, you get a free Office 365 tenant. What else do we have here? So your call to action. Do some stuff. All right. Any questions? Not about the picture. You can ask the picture. Yes, sir.
What about using the REST API and the
Okay.
Yeah, so
They got taken off. Fill out your surveys. Tip your waiters. Thank you.
So the sample, the small link sample, we're going to put it out on GitHub, and it goes into that. But if I want to do REST from a provider-hosted app, what I need to do is use there's two approaches. One's a request executor. So instead of doing like an AJAX dot, and like a Git using like a jQuery syntax, use the same type of or I would say definition, but it's using the executor. There's also an application proxy that you can use. And even further, we now support CORS with the Office 365 API. So you can't do it on premises that way. On premises, you have to use one of the other mechanisms, but we do support CORS in Office 365, which would make it really easy. The issuer licenses?
The issuer IDs that get generated when you register a new cert?
Oh, so
Repeat the question.
Dealing with the issuer IDs when you generate the cert? So the issue.
So the issuer IDs, when you do generate that certificate, the issuer IDs are actually tied to that particular app, unless it's a high trust app, in which case you get one, right? That issuer ID on the back end, because basically what happens behind the scenes is SharePoint creates a secure, trusted identity token issuer, and that's what's used to actually sign your tokens. In order to identify that relationship, it's using the certificate, and the certificate is based on the one that you generate, which is the app. So there's a few options there. One option is I can generate one per app. Every single app, I generate a certificate, I use that certificate, and I give it out to an individual app, right? It becomes a management problem if I want to do that because I got to generate a cert every single time I create an app. The good part about that is because I can isolate each individual app. I rip a cert, app is dead, right? All my other apps are fine. But you got to trade off with management. On the other side, if I want to have one app, one certificate for everyone, then that means that if I rip that cert, everybody's app is dead, right? So you have to weigh it with how am I going to actually generate these things? How am I going to actually use them? What one of my customers is doing is they're creating app websites on the other side, so IIS websites. One website, underneath each website, they're doing one website per business unit. Underneath there, they're creating the different app sub-virtual directories. So each business unit gets a certificate, right? So that's how they're doing it in their environment on-prem. So it's a trade-off. Do I want to manage lots of certs, be high secure, or do I want one certificate because I want my developers to just leave me alone? Does that make sense?
I'm a developer. I don't find it that annoying.
Well, if I'm an infrastructure guy, I want you guys to leave me alone. Yep. Any more questions? Question over there. Yes, so the question is, what on the other side, if I authenticate an app and my app wants to use the same authentication, whether it's ADFS or Windows, by default it's Windows. How do I then take advantage of ADFS in this scenario? So there's another token, there's a gentleman by the name of Steve Peshka. Steve Peshka wrote a token issuer for SAML. So what you do is inside of your app, inside of your provider-hosted app, you have the token provider. You're going to take his class, the one that he generated, and it's out on GitHub, and you're going to plug it in, and you're going to say the token validator, right, the one that gets the context and actually creates the environment to go send it off to SharePoint, instead of using the Windows credential on the thread, I want to use ADFS. And then it creates the correct token environment for it to go send it over to the other side to get validated for that user. But that's possible. Yes, the updated token helper. Yep, for ADFS and FBA. Yep. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming out. Hope you had a great conference. Thank you.